April 1945, Lübeck, northern Germany. The city lay in a grey stillness, the kind that follows months of fire. Buildings stood open like broken teeth, their interiors exposed to the cold spring winds sweeping in from the Baltic. British armored cars rolled carefully along torn cobblestone streets, engines echoing between walls blackened by air raids. Every few meters, soldiers paused, scanning alleys where smoke curled from the rubble of collapsed homes. Among the scattered civilians emerging from hiding, one woman moved with a different urgency. Her coat hung loose on her frame, her steps unsteady. In her arms, a child, pale, silent, too weak to cry. She raised one hand as a British lance corporal approached, rifle slung low but ready. For a moment neither spoke. The war was not yet officially over here, and mistrust still lived in the air like dust. She reached into her pocket, not for a weapon but for a crumpled ration card that no longer meant anything. Her voice trembled in broken English, a plea for food, for anything. The soldier hesitated, torn between orders and the undeniable truth in the child's eyes. What happened next would reflect not just one encounter, but the entire collapsing world around them, a world shaped by the hunger and desperation of Germany's final months. By early 1945, Germany was living its final months of the war in a state of near-total collapse. The Eastern Front had broken wide open under the weight of the Soviet advance. Entire provinces, East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, were emptied as millions of civilians fled westward in one of the largest refugee movements in European history. Long columns of families pushed carts through winter snow, hoping to avoid the violence sweeping in behind them. Many arrived in the northern regions already under strain, adding tens of thousands of hungry mouths to cities that could barely feed their own. Inside the Reich, the food system had crumbled. Years of Allied bombing had shattered rail networks, silos, factories, and port facilities. Farms lacked fertilizer, fuel, and labor. Horses, once vital for agriculture, had been conscripted to the front. Harvests fell sharply every year after 1942, and by 1945 the agricultural output was insufficient to sustain the civilian population. Even official ration levels, never generous, had become meaningless. A German adult was supposed to receive roughly 1,500 calories a day in early 1945, compared to the roughly 3,000 issued to a British citizen. In practice, many Germans received half of that, sometimes less. Northern Germany, including cities like Lübeck, Kiel, and Hamburg, bore scars from relentless RAF bombing. Warehouses stood gutted, bakeries destroyed, food depots buried under rubble. Long before British units crossed into the region, hunger had become an unavoidable part of daily life. Children fainted in schools. Elderly residents died quietly in their homes. Women traded their last possessions on the streets for scraps of bread or a ladle of thin soup. Malnutrition spread across all ages, erasing the distinction between civilians and the defeated army retreating through the same ruined towns. As British and Canadian forces pushed into northern Germany in April 1945, they encountered a civilian population on the edge of starvation. But military orders were clear: they were soldiers first, administrators second. The war had not yet ended. The German army was still resisting in pockets across the north. The Allies feared sabotage, hidden Waffen-SS groups, and last-ditch attacks. That made humanitarian aid complicated, often restricted, and sometimes forbidden. This tension, the collision between military duty and human suffering, became the moral landscape into which British soldiers stepped. And it set the stage for thousands of personal encounters like the one in Lübeck, where one soldier's decision carried the weight of a nation's hunger. When Germany capitulated in May 1945, northern Germany fell under the control of the British occupation authorities. The region was divided into administrative districts, each overseen by military government officers who were suddenly responsible for millions of displaced, malnourished, and desperate civilians. The British expected to govern a defeated enemy. What they found instead was a humanitarian emergency unfolding on a scale difficult to manage with the limited resources at hand. Food shortages deepened in the weeks after surrender. German warehouses were empty, railways lay twisted from bombing runs, and key bridges had collapsed into rivers swollen by spring rains. With transport ruined, even the modest harvests that survived the war could not be moved efficiently. Fuel shortages prevented mills from running, trucks from operating, and fishing boats from leaving port. For months, cities such as Lübeck lived day to day, relying on improvised collections of potatoes, black bread, and anything scavenged or traded through unofficial channels. The British Army faced strict policies meant to maintain order during occupation. One of the most significant was the non-fraternization order. Troops were discouraged, and in some areas forbidden, from forming personal relationships with Germans. This included sharing food. The fear was simple: too much generosity could undermine discipline, blur the line between victor and defeated, or unintentionally aid former Nazi supporters hiding among civilians. The British also had to feed their own troops, supply liberated prisoners of war camps, and assist millions of displaced persons roaming the countryside. Every tin of meat or biscuit ration handed to a German meant one less for someone else under British responsibility. Yet the realities on the ground rarely aligned neatly with policy. Black markets grew overnight, fueled by the basic need to survive. Civilians traded jewelry, furniture, and even family heirlooms for a handful of flour or a few spoonfuls of sugar. Children hovered near British kitchens, hoping for the smallest scrap. Some soldiers turned away, bound by duty. Others faced the moral burden more directly, seeing starvation not as an abstract outcome of war, but as a human face, often a woman, often a child, standing just beyond the perimeter fence. The occupation forces quickly realized that hunger could not be controlled by rules alone. It shaped the behavior of civilians, influenced local security, and even affected the Allied effort to stabilize Germany for the political future that would follow. Every encounter between soldier and civilian became part of this larger, complex picture. Understanding these pressures is essential to grasp the deeper meaning behind one soldier's decision on a street in Lübeck, a decision shaped not only by compassion, but by the vast and difficult conditions of post-war Germany. For German mothers in the final months of the war, survival had become a daily negotiation against forces far larger than themselves. Hunger stripped away everything except the instinct to protect a child. In northern German cities, women stood in long lines outside bakeries that had no bread to sell, clutching ration cards that had lost their meaning. Children grew thin and silent, their bodies adapting to prolonged malnutrition. Dignity became a fragile thing, preserved in the careful mending of a coat, or the quiet refusal to beg unless absolutely necessary. When a mother stepped forward to ask a British soldier for food, it was not an act of submission or manipulation. It was the final measure available to someone who had already exhausted every other option. The human angle of this crisis was defined not by statistics, but by these moments of raw vulnerability, where survival depended on the unpredictable kindness of a stranger in uniform. From the perspective of the British Army, humanitarian needs had to be balanced against operational discipline. The military government faced a collapsing German infrastructure, millions of displaced civilians, and an army of occupation that still had to function efficiently. Food distribution was administered through strict channels, centralized depots, guarded warehouses, and carefully measured civilian rations. The non-fraternization order, enforced across the British zone, sought to keep soldiers detached from the people they now governed. This meant no private exchanges of food, no personal involvement, no gestures that might blur military lines. Commanders feared that individual compassion could compromise broader security or create expectations the army could not sustain. Every tin of corned beef, every bar of chocolate, every biscuit ration was catalogued and accounted for. The system was designed to prevent chaos, but the reality on the ground was far less orderly, and the rules often collided with the moral instincts of the men who enforced them. For British soldiers, the moral dimension of occupation could be as heavy as the fighting that preceded it. They had been trained to see Germany as the enemy, responsible for years of devastation across Europe. Yet in Lübeck, Hamburg, and other northern towns, the figures who approached them were not soldiers, but civilians reduced by hunger. A starving mother did not resemble the propaganda enemy. A silent, underfed child did not embody Nazism. Many soldiers described the unsettling shift that occurred when they saw how destroyed German cities were, and how desperate the population had become. The war had hardened them, but not beyond empathy. Still, they were expected to maintain distance, to follow orders, to ignore pleas that contradicted regulations. This created a quiet conflict inside many of them, a tension between duty and conscience. It was within this moral landscape that a single act of generosity could feel both dangerous and necessary, shaping memories that lasted long after the uniform was hung away. For many German civilians in 1945, the British were no longer seen through the lens of wartime propaganda. The moment Allied troops entered their towns, the image of the enemy shifted rapidly into something more complicated. Soldiers who once symbolized destruction now represented order, access to food, and the possibility of survival. In northern Germany, where starvation had reached dangerous levels, British convoy columns were watched not with fear, but with a quiet, desperate hope. Women waited near the edge of military camps, children lingered around field kitchens, and elderly men approached checkpoints to ask questions in broken English. Civilians knew Allied forces had food, something Germany could no longer provide. This changed the emotional dynamics of occupation. The former enemy became, in many eyes, the only remaining lifeline. And when a British soldier handed a mother even a small ration, it challenged years of propaganda in a single moment, replacing fear with gratitude and disbelief. Behind every decision about food in occupied Germany stood policies shaped by London, SHEF headquarters, and the overriding fear of a Nazi resurgence. Churchill and Allied planners insisted that Germany must not be allowed to recover too quickly, either economically or militarily. Strict controls on food distribution were part of this approach. The level of subsistence policy, used in early occupation planning, aimed to provide Germans with enough calories to survive, but not enough to rebuild strength or industry. SHEF orders emphasized caution. Generous civilian feeding might weaken the hard line needed to prevent the rebuilding of hostile structures or underground resistance. At the same time, Britain itself was still rationing heavily, and public sentiment at home opposed feeding the nation they had fought for 6 years. These political pressures created a narrow margin for humanitarian action. Soldiers on the ground were caught between compassion for suffering civilians and the strategic decisions set far above them. Feeding a starving population required more than good intentions. It demanded logistics, organization, and the science of nutrition, areas the British military had developed through years of global warfare. Standard British 24-hour ration packs, tins of kumpo, meat, biscuits, and emergency chocolate had been engineered for durability and caloric density. But distributing these supplies to civilians was never straightforward. Supply convoys were already stretched thin supporting troops, refugee camps, and liberated POWs. Food depots had to be guarded. Transportation networks had to be rebuilt before large-scale civilian feeding was possible. Even humanitarian shipments from abroad could not be distributed effectively until ports and railways were restored. This meant that, in the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, the simplest act, one soldier handing a single ration pack to a starving mother, carried weight far beyond its size. It represented what the system could not yet provide: immediate relief, delivered by a human hand, without bureaucracy or delay. The street in Lübeck where the woman approached him was a narrow corridor of broken brick and drifting dust. British units were still securing nearby buildings, checking for stragglers and possible booby traps. The air smelled of wet stone and burned timber. Lance Corporal Thomas Wainwright, 23 years old, tired from weeks of pushing through northern Germany, had been ordered to hold position near a collapsed shop front when he saw her. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, as though unsure whether approaching an Allied soldier might provoke harm. Her child, no more than 4 or 5, clung weakly to her shoulder. The boy's head rested against her neck, eyes half closed, too exhausted even to look up. Wainwright had seen hungry civilians before, but something in her expression, fear tightly wrapped around desperation, made him pause. She spoke in halting English, each word strained. "Please, food, for my child." Her free hand trembled as she lifted the useless ration card. Wainwright hesitated. He knew the rule: no fraternization. The order had been repeated each morning since entering Germany. Food was controlled, guarded, and counted. Soldiers were not to hand out personal rations. Violations could mean disciplinary action. In the uncertain early days of occupation, the British command feared any blurring of lines. But up close, the regulation collided with reality. The child's lips were cracked, his skin pale in a way that spoke of weeks without proper nourishment. The mother's coat hung loose along her frame, her cheekbones sharp beneath the dirt. They were not a threat. They were simply starving. His mind raced through the conflict, the rules, the warnings, the long months of seeing German troops resist with fanatical determination. Yet none of that seemed connected to the woman standing in front of him, hands shaking from hunger, pride dissolving under the weight of survival. Slowly, without speaking, he reached into the small canvas pouch attached to his webbing. His fingers touched a familiar shape, a sealed British 24-hour ration pack. Inside was enough to sustain a soldier for an entire day: biscuits, corned beef, chocolate, tea tablets, and a tin of condensed milk. For a German civilian in April 1945, this was not just food. It was unimaginable abundance. He knew the consequences. Giving it away meant he would go hungry until resupply. It meant breaking an order that officers took seriously. Still, he removed the pack, held it for a long moment, then placed it gently into her hands. She stared at it as though it were a mistake. A full ration pack was something she had not seen even in the early war years. The weight of it shocked her, heavier than any food she had carried in months, heavier with the sudden realization that someone who should have been an enemy was offering her family a chance to survive one more day. She looked up, eyes filling with disbelief, almost fear, as if kindness itself had become foreign in a world defined by destruction. And in that suspended moment, the silence between them held the weight of the entire war's ending. For a few seconds neither moved. The street around them continued its quiet rhythm, boots scraping over debris, orders called in low voices, the distant rumble of an armored engine. But at the center of that ruined block, the handover of a simple ration pack created its own stillness. 2 British soldiers nearby had noticed. One raised an eyebrow, the other gave a subtle shake of his head, an unspoken warning. They all knew the rules. Non-fraternization wasn't just a guideline, it was part of the chain of discipline expected to stabilize occupied Germany. Wainwright felt their eyes on him, waiting to see whether he would retract the ration or justify it somehow. But he didn't. He kept his posture steady, shoulders squared, accepting whatever consequences might come. The woman held the pack as though afraid someone might take it back. Her fingers pressed into the seams of the box, confirming it was real. She whispered something in German, soft, shaky, a mixture of "thank you" and disbelief. The child finally stirred, lifting his head toward the unfamiliar object in his mother's arms. His gaze locked on the small tin of condensed milk visible through the torn corner. That alone was more nourishment than he had consumed in days. Wainwright reached into his pocket again, ignoring the quiet tension growing behind him. This time he took out a small emergency chocolate bar, the kind issued to infantrymen for energy during long marches. It was dense, bitter, and designed to keep a soldier functioning under extreme conditions. For a starving child, it was a lifeline. He crouched down, lowering himself to the child's level. The boy didn't step forward. He was too weak, too unsure. So Wainwright placed the chocolate gently into the mother's free hand. She looked overwhelmed, glancing between the ration pack, the chocolate, and the soldier. Tears formed, carving clean lines through the soot on her cheeks. One of the nearby British soldiers finally approached, not confrontationally, but with the resigned expression of someone witnessing a choice they understood, even if it broke regulation. He muttered under his breath, "You'll catch it for that, Tom." Wainwright didn't deny it. "I know," he whispered back. But the moment was no longer about rules. The mother pulled the child close and carefully broke a corner off the chocolate, offering it to him with trembling hands. The boy tasted it, then clutched at it with sudden urgency, too hungry to restrain himself, too young to understand rationing. The first real calories entering his body brought a faint spark of life back into his eyes. For the British soldiers watching, the scene left a quiet imprint. They had fought their way through Holland and into Germany, seen towns leveled, comrades lost, enemy resistance fierce. Yet here, on a ruined street in Lübeck, the war's ending was distilled into something both fragile and profound, a defeated civilian child receiving kindness from a man who had arrived as a conqueror. Moments like these did not end the war, but they softened its final days. They chipped away at old hatred, made occupation less hostile, and reminded soldiers and civilians alike that survival, physical and moral, depended on more than orders. What happened next would determine how such acts were remembered and how they shaped the early days of British occupation in northern Germany. In the weeks following the British occupation of northern Germany, Lübeck and neighboring towns began the slow, painful process of stabilization. British authorities, recognizing the severity of civilian starvation, gradually authorized controlled food distributions. Initial rations were limited, roughly 1,300 calories per civilian per day, carefully measured to ensure that supplies lasted until additional shipments could arrive. Military kitchens were repurposed to serve local populations, and convoys brought flour, tinned meat, condensed milk, and emergency biscuits from ports in the United Kingdom and liberated areas of France. Reports from soldiers on the ground provide vivid testimony to the gradual relief. Corporal Edward Hughes of the Royal Engineers recalled delivering sacks of flour to a bombed-out district in Hamburg. The children lined up with hands stretched, silent at first, then eyes lighting up when they saw the bread. I had never felt such weight from a loaf of bread before. Similar accounts from other units describe mothers carefully rationing food for their children, elderly citizens finally able to consume a full meal, and local communities organizing around newly established soup kitchens. These small, practical interventions alleviated immediate hunger and restored a measure of dignity to those who had suffered through years of scarcity. The easing of starvation was not immediate. Railways were still damaged, coal supplies limited, and the weather in spring 1945 complicated agricultural recovery. Yet, even a modest ration pack provided daily caloric relief, stabilizing families and reducing the risk of disease and death from prolonged malnutrition. The presence of British troops, disciplined in their allocation of resources, also helped reduce the chaos of black market trading, allowing food to reach those most in need rather than being hoarded or sold for profit. In this way, small acts, like the one Lance Corporal Wainwright committed on a Lübeck street, were multiplied across the occupation zone, shaping both survival and perception. By June 1945, reports suggested that civilian starvation was slowly retreating, though not entirely eliminated. The contrast between the desolation of April and the cautious revival of daily life in summer highlighted the impact of British administrative policies, military discipline, and humanitarian interventions. The consequences of these early humanitarian efforts extended far beyond immediate survival. Starving civilians, once bound tightly to the ideological narratives of the Nazi regime, began to reassess their loyalties. In northern Germany, towns that had been strongholds of National Socialist sentiment now saw the occupation forces not as conquerors, but as reluctant saviors. Acts of generosity, even as simple as a ration handed to a mother, planted seeds of reconciliation that would grow in the post-war years. Families that received assistance were more willing to cooperate with British authorities, providing information about local conditions, abandoned munitions, and displaced populations. For many Germans, these gestures humanized the enemy in ways propaganda could not undo. Women and children, previously silent observers of the war's devastation, began to interact cautiously but openly with the soldiers, forming the fragile social connections necessary to rebuild civil order. Politically, these efforts laid groundwork for broader recovery initiatives. As Europe stabilized under Allied administration, the seeds of economic revival began to take root. The Marshall Plan, introduced in 1948, would draw directly on the lessons learned during this period: the importance of immediate relief, the need to restore trust between nations, and the recognition that hunger and deprivation could destabilize even the most controlled occupation. Northern Germany's experience in 1945 provided a microcosm of these principles in action. For the German civilians themselves, memories of such compassion lingered long after ration lines disappeared. Oral histories collected in the decades following the war recount mothers and children recalling small acts of kindness, a chocolate bar, a loaf of bread, a soldier's gentle words, moments that made the difference between life and death. These recollections became part of the narrative of survival, and of the gradual reconciliation between former enemies. By the summer of 1945, the city streets of Lübeck were quieter, less desperate, and slowly more organized. Children's laughter began to return, even if faint, and families could again plan meals rather than scavenge for scraps. The immediate horrors of starvation were not erased, but the bridge between cruelty and compassion had been crossed. These early interactions shaped not only the morale of civilians but also the moral legacy of the occupation itself, preparing the ground for a more stable and humane post-war Germany. In the ruins of Lübeck, amid shattered streets and hollowed buildings, one simple act, a ration handed from soldier to mother, became a quiet testament to the power of humanity. War had reduced cities to rubble, families to hunger, and ideology to despair. Yet even in the shadow of total devastation, compassion persisted, slipping through the cracks of rules, orders, and the rigid structures of occupation. That small moment did not alter the course of the war, nor erase the suffering that had come before. But it illuminated a truth far larger than any battlefield victory, that survival, dignity, and moral courage can coexist, even in the most broken of worlds. Victory, in this light, was not measured solely by captured territory or surrendered armies. It was measured in moments where the conqueror chose mercy over obedience, where a soldier recognized a child's hunger as more urgent than regulation, where the defeated saw a glimmer of hope instead of the shadow of revenge. These instances, fleeting, fragile, human, redefined the meaning of triumph. For the mother and her child, for the countless civilians who watched and remembered, that day became more than survival. It became proof that empathy could pierce the walls built by fear and hatred. In a continent scarred by ideology and conflict, small acts of humanity quietly shaped the path toward reconciliation, reminding us that even amid the darkest chapters of history, mercy endures as a force as vital as any army or strategy.